The leaders of the G20 are meeting in the capital of Argentina, Buenos Aires, where Chinese President Xi Jinping has made a speech reiterating China's desire for a constructive and cooperative multilateralism to move world economic growth and development forward. Issues of international trade, climate change, immigration and protectionism are all on the table for the world leaders, with little assurance that consensus can be reached. So what are the big topics for this G20 summit, and what results are likely? To discuss the full range of issues, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Mr. Ina Tangen, Current Affairs Commentator. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Dong. Gentlemen, I'd like to start with the theme of this year's G20 summit, building consensus for fair and sustainable development. So from the outcome of the leaders' meeting, do you think any consensus has been reached?
So far, I think they're still discussing the final statement for the G20 meeting. So you can see there's difficulties to reach the consensus at this moment. And the topic of this year,
what are difficulties? Could you be a little bit more specific?
So far, it seems like there are three specific questions people are concerned about and not reaching the final agreement. Number one is climate change. Of course, you know that the United States quit the Paris Agreement from very early on, and so far people still are not sure which are the positions of developed countries, particularly the United States, and their commitment down the road. And then on the other hand, China and other countries trying to push forward with more commitment from other countries, and China is playing a leading role in this particular area. And secondly is about the trade disputes and multilateralism versus unilateralism in this area, and how to deal with the rising protectionism in the world. And third, of course, is a specific question about countries, particularly developed countries, which is immigration. And other countries, particularly right-wing politicians, are having more and more voice in those countries trying to prevent immigrants coming into the country, and they have huge divide in those countries about what immigration policy should be. So reflected in this G20 meeting, the immigration issue became a very thorny issue for those countries, and to reach agreement with other countries in the G20.
And those are three big difficulties. And Mr. Tangen, are you optimistic that leaders will reach any kind of consensus or even agree to disagree?
Well, what you have to look at is the G20. Why was it created? Global financial crisis. And it was supposed to be a group who showed that the world could pull together as necessary to create solutions, economically at least. It kind of morphed since then, but now it is really the opposite of that. It's really highlighting a lot of the dissension within all the three articles, three issues that you things. It goes beyond this kind of how can we cooperate to whether or not we should. I mean, there's issues about the WTO that are being injected to this and whether it should survive, all of these types of things. There is an attack, and it's very clear. You have on one side Donald Trump in the U.S. administration saying, the world in order to go forward should follow American exceptionalism. This idea that American hegemony, both politically, including politically, economically, and militarily, is necessary to bring the world into a liberal, democratic, capitalist order. On the other side of it, you have, I think, the majority of the world, which is saying we really don't necessarily want that kind of imposition. We're looking to continue the multilateralism that has led to the, huge growth, not just for China, but for the rest of the world. If you start looking at the numbers over the last 20, 25 years, there's been a tremendous amount of progress made. So they're still going on that. I think if you really examine the catchphrase that they were using for the G20, it's quite clear that they're looking for multilateralism. But the issue is, where is the United States, and how are they going to use their superior powers at this point in order to affect this group?
And we'll be talking about that very soon. Since you mentioned the very origin of the G20, it was formed after a major financial crisis, and it's aimed to deal with global challenges, at least economically. And this brings us to Chinese President Xi Jinping's proposals in his speech at a meeting. He urged G20 members to forge a strong partnership and set up macro policy coordination. Is there a sense of urgency that the world is in lack of macro policy coordination this time?
Well, obviously, you have the U.S. who is, until just recently, a couple of days ago, was pulling back. They were increasing interest rates, I think in preparation for what a lot of people believe will be an oncoming recession in about 14 to 16 months. And the lack of coordination has led to this money glut around the world. I mean, Europe is still doing quantitative easing. They're still doing a portion of it, although less in Japan. And this lack of coordination is leading to these situations where you have money flows occurring artificially because one nation is doing it, another is not. And this is having adverse effects. And if you don't control that part of it, right, you're going to see a world in disarray, everyone going for themselves. This was the exact opposite of what the G20 was about. The G20 was about collective action in furtherance of the common good. Right? This is now descending into chaos, where if every man for himself, the law of the jungle. And this is what Xi is saying. We cannot go back to those days. We have to forge ahead. There has to be a consensus amongst ourselves where no one is imposing anything or talking about imposing anything from the Chinese side. What we do is we together have to come to an agreement how we can go forward and extend the prosperity that has been achieved so far.
Right, let's take a look at other proposals raised by Chinese President Xi Jinping. He said members should stay committed to openness and cooperation and uphold multilateral trading system. So what has China done in this regard in recent years?
I think, first of all, I want to emphasize what Ms. Tang had just said. I think right now the world is facing two pictures, two visions for the future. One is everyone's for themselves, just like Tang pointed out. It's going to be the rule of jungle, right? So America first, or other countries go for their countries first, Russia first, Turkey first, or China first. So if everybody just serve their own interest, and building up walls against each other, this whole global system will fall apart, and the outcome will not be a win-win situation. Everybody will lose. President Xi has pointed this out, and China has proposed its own kind of scheme and agenda for the future of the world economy, which is shared community for shared future. So in this respect, I think President Xi has pointed out we need to work together, increase cooperation, and particularly China leading in terms of opening up its own market to share its prosperity with other countries. And also in this respect, China would really encourage for the development, improvement of multilateral institutions and mechanisms so that people can resolve their disputes, their differences within the system, instead of just pulling out and try to impose sanctions or other measures against others using, for instance, national security excuses.
So back to multilateralism, be specific, the multilateral trading system. What do you make of the challenges in the WTO's, the World Trade Organization's reform?
Yeah, WTO is the fundamental multilateral global trading system that in place since the 1995 until now. And even before that, GATT has played a very important role. So I think countries, more and more countries joining this system so that everybody can benefit from it. Let's go back. I think from the very beginning of early 2017, for instance, in Davos, President Xi has already said that we need to have an open system. And he has encouraging and putting out this message continuously for the last 2 years. And just recently in APEC, he has said, we have to insist on this message and we have to champion for the multilateralism. WTO is at the center of this mechanism, and without WTO, people will fall back to regional agreements, and sometimes incomplete regional agreements. So far, I mean, there are a number of regional agreements, but none of them reach the level of the and comprehensiveness of WTO. So once the WTO is harmed and incomplete and out of the picture, then everybody will go for themselves, and it's very hard for the global trading system work as before. So that's why I think China has insisted on maintaining the legitimacy and the work, of the WTO, and particularly China is willing to work with other countries, EU, Japan, and with the United States, to resolve their differences. And China has already put up
Talking
its
about
own
differences,
proposal.
you just mentioned several countries, and China is a developing country, and all those other countries you just mentioned are developed countries, and that's a main sticking point in the reform of WTO, because the United States has been accusing China for taking advantage of the system. Obviously, they try to, get China out of its developing country treatment in the WTO. What's your take on this, Mr. Tangam?
Well, I mean, WTO has been stalled, as we know, from the Doha round. It's been many, many years, and it's really over the apportionment of how social change will occur and what kind of financial support would be given by the developed to the undeveloped nations. And this is why it's stopped. But the trade side has remained strong. But let's go back a few years to when China entered the WTO in 1991. In essence, what happened was China was forced to take the most onerous deal there was. Right? I mean, no other country had been subject to all of the conditions that were put on China. So China was in a situation where it swallowed its pride. It said, well, we'll make the best of this and we'll go forward. But they studied the documents, and because they have to obey the letter, there was a question of whether they didn't feel they had to obey the spirit in some senses, simply because it had been forced on them. What would the world be like today if we could reverse back then? And instead of putting these onerous criteria on China, they had simply said, look, we need to work together. This is about not only the letter, but the spirit. Right? So we're not trying to harm you. We're not trying to cause regime change by forcing these things on you in the hopes that this would put an end to your current system of government. Instead, they said, we want you to do well. We want a world of shared values. That didn't happen. So perhaps in the past is buried some of the answers to our current predicament. I think China now realizes it has become much more mature, and they've said, look, we have to put those things aside. Now we have to come together and figure it out. But right now, the United States, and hasn't hinted, it has said categorically it does not like the WTO. It is going to strangle the WTO by making sure that there are no new appellate court judges. Without those judges, right, there can be no binding way of settling any dispute, and at which point the WTO literally becomes completely useless. Now, in terms of these regional things, I think there are some things, both TPP and RCEP. These are entities which are, yes, still incomplete to a degree, but they have within them the ability, and the rest of the world is going to have to make a decision. This is not just about China and the US. The rest of the world is 60% of the world's GDP. How they vote with their feet in terms of, yes, we're going to join multilateral organizations like TPP or RCEP, or we're just going to knuckle under to the U.S. and become, in essence, a vassal state with a bilateral trade and security deal.
And let's take a look at China's very current trade situation. China's customs authorities released the country's latest trade figures Saturday noon, and by November this year, China's total foreign trade volume has already surpassed last year's with an annual increase of 15%. What do you make of these figures?
Well, that means up until later this year, the global recovery is still very much alive. So ever since 2008, the financial crisis, the global economic crisis, a lot of countries are struggling and trying to, and through G20, a lot of countries coordinated their financial and economic economic policies. And after that, there's some success, even though some countries struggled and some countries recovered very slowly. However, by I think 2 to 3 years ago, there's a coordinated global recovery, and the trade has been picking up gradually, and the trade has been growing very quickly. So China and other countries, exporting countries, benefited from the recovery of developed countries, and emerging countries are doing relatively well. However, the post-success cannot predict the future success. We need to resolve the issue right now, the trade
war with
the trade war with the United States, and not only that, but the weakness in emerging markets. I mean, we have to, for instance, take care of the innovation, have more,
Yeah, talking about that, leaders of BRICS countries also met on the sidelines of the G20 gathering. What key messages have you got from that meeting?
I think one of the things well, it's related to the question you just asked right now, the right of developing countries in the economic system. I think there are two economic philosophies right now. There are market fundamentalists who believe, there's only pure free markets, and you need to do it all the way down. Like they suggest the 3 zeros: zero tariffs, zero subsidies, and so on and so forth. So basically, they believe you need to do it reciprocally with developed countries, even though you are a developing country. So there are so many. Yeah, exactly. That's impossible. But they believe it's possible. They believe that's the only fairness in the world. But then, of course, there are other philosophies like developmentalism, believing that the developing countries should have the right to protect some areas that they feel is not fully developed, and they should get some preferential treatment from the developed countries. And particularly when their economy is still growing, and in many areas like environmental control, labor regulations, some of those areas they should have some leeways, right? So comparing to what the U.S. is asking and what developing countries, not only China but India and all the other BRIC countries are able to offer, there are a great gap. So overall, I think in order to bridge this gap and try to find a common ground between the two philosophies, we need to work hard and try to resolve this issue through multilateral mechanisms.
Well, Mr. Tangen, you're about to add something to Dr. Zhao's remarks.
I think that people are increasingly going to start looking at RCEP, because what you have there is your country has about a 5% wiggle room. You can decide 5% of your GDP, and then gradually over the years that's reduced. But what it does is allows you, for political purposes, for developmental purposes, to protect parts of your economy within an acceptable way. 95% open, 5% protected, that's a pretty good thing. And this kind of flexibility, rather than this kind of rigid adherence to the 3 zeros, that's very ideological. And I think this is one of the major differences that you see occurring here. It's not only the vision, but there's also a stylistic difference. I mean, China talks about consensus, all right? The U.S. talks about imposition, all right? It's not the same thing. So you have a world that has to make these decisions. And as I said, it's 60% of the world, and they're the ones who are going to vote with their feet, and they're going to vote for their economic interest. Hopefully they see that as a shared vision of common prosperity, not something where it's the law of the jungle.
You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. Something that is already in place, the replacement of the NAFTA deal, the trade deal between United States, Mexico and Canada. Is this an overhaul of NAFTA, or is this exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump wanted, also known as America First?
No, I mean, first off, it's not it's America First, but if you look at the different names, depending on where you are, in Canada it's Canada First, in Mexico it's Mexico First, in the U.S. it's things. It's actually not a very good thing, and we were talking about this before. Actually, the reason NAFTA was going to fade away, it was going to be supplanted by TPP. So that's why no one has been discussing this for many, many years, and people were very surprised that Donald Trump was talking about NAFTA during the things, because it was going to go away. And the U.S. had spent a lot of time and a lot of political capital getting everything that it wanted, or it possibly could, into TPP. There are about 13 provisions that protected specifically American industries, big tobacco, big pharma, big tech, and it goes on and on. So everyone was surprised when the U.S., who had the most favorable deal, who had put so much pressure on it, withdraws from TPP, thus throwing open this question of what do you do with NAFTA. Now, the agreement, everybody who's looked through the NAFTA agreement, despite many clauses in there that are similar to what was in TPP, they say it's TPP light. If the U.S. had gone with TPP, it would have a much better deal than it has now. And it's not significantly different from the original NAFTA. So it seems at this point that this was simply a rebranding. Now remember, Donald Trump is all about branding. He doesn't want anything with anybody's footprints or name on it. He wants his own. So I think this was not as big an issue as people think. It was just simply a public relations exercise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Exactly. I totally agree. I think one of the most important things is that if you look at this new USMCA deal, a lot of items are actually copy-paste from the TPP. And the concerns of U.S. companies like intellectual property protection, and also financial regulations and also digital economy regulations, a lot of things are just put into there. NAFTA is bound to be upgraded because NAFTA created like more than 20 years ago, right? So there's supposed to be upgradation from that original deal. This deal is not completely new. It's just a timely upgrade from that original deal. And the thing is, this new treaty between the three countries will not achieve what President Trump originally wanted to achieve. That is to move manufacturing jobs from overseas, particularly from Mexico, back to the U.S. In reverse, actually, if this treaty comes into effect, more factories will move to Mexico, will move to Canada than less. So I think overall, this is the deal that probably won't satisfy Trump's original ask. However, it satisfied his ego, basically.
And the proof of that is GM announcing 15,000 people laid off and 2 factories closing.
Exactly. So we've talked a lot about trade. What about another big question, finding new impetus for world economic growth? In his speech, President Xi Jinping mentioned specifically on the role of new technologies. What do you make of this proposal, Dr. Zhang?
Well, I think in this world we have so many new technologies emerging. We're at the eve, probably already one step into the next technological and scientific revolution. And there's so many technologies we're still exploring, like what happened recently, the gene editing, right? So there are dangerous side of the new technology, AI, big data. So people's privacy and a lot of humans' basic fundamental features we need to protect and need to figure out exactly morally what to do. But then on the other hand, we need to champion this and to have a policy to lead innovation and to harness the innovation for human good and for the future development, to discover more potentials for development. So I think it's very critical at this moment, and really G20 should come together and to have government policy to deal with the economic revolution instead of arguing with each other and walling up against each other. I think Europe played a leading role. They have a new law, GDPR, coming out trying to protect privacy, and China is also updating its own law for internet security. But I think in this way people need to coordinate and so that create a common space for the technology to develop on the one hand, but then on the other hand to make sure people's communities and societies are maintained.
When we talk about research of the new technologies and utilization of those technologies, it may lead to another big question, which is the imbalance of development status among world's countries, because usually it has more to do with a country's economic strength rather than your unwillingness to use new technology or not. So how does this link to inclusive development, another topic mentioned by President Xi Jinping in his speech?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about this digital gap for many, many years now, and now you have all the new technology, robotics, biotechnology. This technology gap is growing bigger and bigger. The consequence of that is creating rich and poor. The inequality in each society is expanding dramatically, and that is showing up in the United States and in European countries that actually give the pretty much put forward this agenda of populism. So in order to reduce populism, you need to have inclusive economic development, which requires the government to put out policies that will reduce inequality, provide retraining for their workers so that their workforce can face and to adapt to the new technology. But now what happened is that because populism is rising and pushing the government to have more protectionist policies instead of more domestic policies to help their people, working class people, and now we're in coordination. So that's why in this G20 I think it's very important for the leaders to realize the importance of policy coordination, and particularly to have domestic policies to help to reduce the gap and alleviate the pain for the people left behind.
And overall speaking, we've been talking about so many challenges and also so many internal differences. Overall speaking, Mr. Tangen, do you think the role of the G20 in global governance has been weakened by rising protectionism and unilateralism, or it's status quo as before, or you are expecting a kind of strengthening role in the near future?
Well, obviously I would go on the side that it has been weakened severely because you're playing out all these differences on the world stage. You're highlighting your differences as opposed to how you can cooperate together. I think it's very important. In terms of what you were saying, I think people should try to understand this. Technology is important because it brings efficiencies. Right? These efficiencies can be garnered back to people. For instance, if you're not going to a bricks and mortar store and you're ordering online, the cost of delivering that good to you versus going through this step-by-step old-fashioned retail is less. All right, so that means there's more money for the company, the goods themselves are cheaper, it's more reliable. These are the types of things that are going. Now, within this idea that there's going to be a lot of efficiencies, a lot of productivity gains in there. In the U.S. and Europe, ironically, because they have these large entities, these large companies who invested a lot of money in existing technology, they're afraid they're going to be leapfrogged by places like China, which is already, it doesn't have this kind of big infrastructure, it's already going forward. This is why you're seeing this concern about 5G, about AI, data collection. All of these things are part of this greater efficiency that if China achieves, all right, could be a threat. Now, on the other hand, having said this, the big corporations are very loath to give up. Why should I give up my 4G and go to 5G? That's going to cost me more money. I'd rather get as much money as I can out of this. So, for instance, the U.S. and Germany, far from being the fastest internet speeds that you can get, are actually kind of in middle of the pack when it comes to developed nations. Why? Because of the corporate structure of these things. So this is kind of where some of the imbalance is coming. I agree with you about income disparity and things like that, but that can be solved. All right, that's why you have taxes. This is why you have. I
believe every country wants to embrace latest technology, internet. Everyone loves it, but for many countries, just lack the basic infrastructure to set up proper internet connection. That's so infrastructure is a big problem, and is also a big focus of this year's G20 gathering. And China has been promoting infrastructure in a win-win way around the world. That is the Belt and Road Initiative. What do you make of the role of that?
Okay, the debate is always aside, are you putting people into debtors' prisons or are you improving their lives? The thing that people have to understand that is until the Belt and Road is connected, until it is an entity that can move goods and services from one end to the other end, and along the way, all right, produce jobs and economic activity, every single piece of it is not worth what you're putting in. It is the collective. Saying I have one gear from for an engine, what is it worth? Nothing. It doesn't do anything. But if I put it into as many parts that I put into an engine that drives my car, yes, then it is worthwhile. So this is the ongoing debate. Part of it really is, it has to do with the U.S. fear that China is supplanting it in the world politically and economically, and that's usual. The question is, how do you deal with these pressures? And right now, with populism, it's very, very difficult because all of these guys are going towards the fear card. They tell
a lot of challenges ahead indeed for world leaders. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.